So tonight I want to introduce Scott Thompson. He works with me in statistical research. He's been doing CRM for 18 or so years. Before that, he was an archivist. He's got 2 master's degrees, one in education and one in history. He's a jack of all trades. He's an historian, a scholar in built environment. He does a lot of nominations for the National Register. And he's just an all-around good guy. And so I'd really like to introduce him tonight. He's going to be talking about research he's been doing over the last 15 or so years with statistical research on a variety of different contracts on the history of ranching on the Berriem Goldwater Range. And I think Scott will have a lot of really interesting insight, not only from the early period, but from the later period, once the Army Air Force got going on the BMGR. So please give Scott a warm welcome. Sorry?
Well, thank you everyone for allowing me to be here tonight. I've got a lot of material to plow through, and so I thought it would be best to read my remarks just to make sure that I cover everything. So again, as John mentioned, my name is Scott Thompson. I'm an applied historian. I'm not an archaeologist. I don't play one on TV, but I'm surrounded by them every working day of my life. And the company I work for, Statistical Research, Inc., I'll refer to it periodically as SRI. So this presentation provides a brief overview of the history of bygone cattle ranching activities on the Berriem Goldwater Range East in Arizona. Now, the Berriem Goldwater Range, or BMGR as I'm going to refer to it, is the nation's second largest tactical aviation range and has functioned as one of the premier aviation training facilities for the U.S. Air Force and the air arm of other military branches for over 75 years. Since the beginning of World War II, the BMGR has contributed to the nation's defense by preparing successive generations of pilot for global combat. Currently, the Air Force and the Marine Corps operate and use the range for training in aerial gunnery, rocketry, electronic warfare, and tactical maneuvering and air support. The range is also used by the Air Force Reserve, Air National Guard, Navy, Army National Guard, and air crews of allied nations. Now, the information that I'm going to present to you tonight is based on a combination of archival and oral historical research, as well as some limited field investigations to many of these ranching sites, these abandoned ranching sites on the range. The primary and secondary sources reviewed for developing this presentation were found at regional repositories, including government offices, state archives, historical societies, and research institutions. Oral historical research, which is really important, especially dealing with a topic in a remote area where oftentimes there are very few written other primary source materials, is incredibly important. And so that research included consulting the transcripts of interviews with longtime residents of the BMGR area. Some of the interviews were conducted in the 1980s by Bill Broyles through his efforts to document the history of the Western Papagonia. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Western Papagonia, that's the geographic and cultural region in which the BMGR East lies. Others were conducted by SRI during the late 1990s and early 2000s as part of the BMGR Oral History Project, carried out under contract to Luke Air Force Base. I'd like to acknowledge Bill Broyles, who's sitting in the center back there, as well as my current and former SRI employees whose research is included in this presentation. The footprint of the BMGR is defined by its restricted airspace and constitutes about 2.7 million acres, 1/3 of which lies over the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge. I know this map is a little bit hard to see, but this is the BMGR, the land area, and this area here is the restricted airspace. In 1999, Congress reauthorized the withdrawal of more than 1.7 million acres of public land in Maricopa, Pima, and Yuma counties for military use. The range is divided into eastern and western sections, with the dividing line running through the Mohawk and Sierra Pinta mountain ranges. Jurisdiction over the BMGR East and BMGR West is assigned to the Air Force and Navy, respectively. I do want to give a shout out to the 56 Range Management Office, or RMO, at Luke Air Force Base, because they're the entity that administers the land and airspace of the BMGR East. And the Cultural Resource Program is managed by dedicated archaeologists who ensure the rich cultural histories of the range are identified, documented, and managed. In addition to inventorying and evaluating the historical significance of cultural resources on training lands, the Cultural Resources Program protects numerous sites in proximity to military targets and works hard to promote public outreach, interagency collaboration, and Native American consultation. The lands that make up the BMGR East are rich in cultural resources that predate the landscape's use as a military training installation, and abandoned ranching sites dating to the late 19th and early to mid 20th centuries have been recorded in archaeological surveys. These sites, many of which are eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, typically have a variety of features associated with stock raising, such as wells, windmills, water tanks and troughs, fences, corrals, loading chutes, and tent and house foundations. Historical period trash dumps containing cans, bottle glass, ceramics, Papago pottery, barbed wire, and other utilitarian items provide information on the age of the ranching sites and associated activities. Rock art depicting cattle brands has also been recorded. I'm going to stay on this slide for a few minutes. I want to give you an overview of cattle ranching, the historical origins of cattle ranching in southern Arizona, and then transition to specifically talking about cattle ranching on the lands that constitute the BMGR East. Cattle ranching in the western Papagueria predates the U.S. acquisition of southern Arizona. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado is believed to have been the first to introduce cattle to what is now Arizona during his 1540 expedition to explore the northern borderlands of New Spain. This herd was likely consumed as food as opposed to being used to establish a breeding population. The first recorded attempt to introduce animal husbandry to the present-day southern Arizona occurred in the 1690s when the Jesuit priest Eusebio Kino distributed small herds of Andalusian cattle and horses to Native American villages in the Santa Cruz and San Pedro River valleys. The Andalusian breed was well suited for the semi-arid conditions of the region. Now, both the Spanish colonial, Both the Spanish colonial and Mexican governments gave land grants to Hispanic settlers to encourage permanent settlement in areas that, due to Apache depredations, were only tenuous parts of their territory. Although the land grant system helped establish cattle ranching as a dominant economic activity, stock raising during the Spanish colonial and Mexican periods was generally limited to the Santa Cruz Valley in southern Arizona, where an established military presence afforded ranchers and a large population of Pima-speaking Indians a measure of protection from the Apache raiding parties. Meat from the cattle was consumed locally, and the hides and tallow were exported as far away as Spain. Following the acquisition of present-day Arizona, through the Gadsden Purchase of 1854, Anglo-American attempts to raise cattle were similarly limited because of the risk of Apache raids. However, ranching in southern Arizona proliferated in the 1870s following the subjugation of the Apache. And I want to note that here and throughout this presentation, when I say the Anglo-American era, that's defined as a political period beginning with the American occupation of the area now known as Arizona and really has nothing to do with ethnicity. So during the Anglo-American period, early herds consisted of Texas Longhorns and Mexican Criollos, descended lineally from the Andalusian cattle of Spain and imported to the New World following the Spanish conquest. Difficult to fatten, their beef value was poor. However, they were excellent foragers and able to endure periods of drought. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, the cattle ranching industry in southern Arizona sought to improve the bloodlines to produce high-quality stock that could acclimate to the rugged range with its rough forage. Southern Arizona ranchers Colin Cameron and H.C. Hooker began breeding Herefords on a large scale in the 1880s. Ultimately, the Hereford and Hereford crossbreeds prevailed as being best suited to the southern Arizona ranges. Historically, raising beef cattle on the open range has been an important economic activity in southern Arizona since the first Europeans settled the region. Open range ranching is a practice that allowed the owner of cattle to turn them loose to roam open spaces without regard to land ownership. Following the Gadsden Purchase, the U.S. government permitted, at least initially, unregulated grazing on its newly acquired lands. Both large and small-scale operators in southern Arizona employed the Texas system of cattle ranching, meaning the cattle were allowed to care for themselves year-round on the open range with no supplementary feeding or protection. Typically, cattle ranchers acquired patented land under the Homestead Act of 1862 or later similar acts to secure a reliable water source and then allow their livestock to forage on the surrounding terrain. During the open range period, cattle roamed where they wished, branding marked ownership, and few fences existed. This coincided with the arrival of the railroad in the early 1880s, which launched a new era of economic development in southern Arizona and boosted the cattle industry by connecting the region to national markets. Ranchers now had geographically distant outlets for their products and could receive necessary supplies. Ranching was greatly increased after 1880, and by 1891, the cattle industry in Arizona peaked at nearly 750,000 head, contributing to the general exhaustion of the fragile ranges. Overgrazing of private and public land holdings, compounded by a severe drought from 1891 to 1893, had a disastrous effect on the Arizona grasslands and forced cattle ranchers to modify their approach to raising livestock. In the 1880s, ranchers grazed large herds on the open range for sale to beef markets in California and other parts of the nation. Following the drought, they limited the size of their herds by specializing in superior breeds of cattle and then shipping them to feedlots for fattening. To prevent overgrazing of public lands, the federal government began enacting policies regarding the access to federal lands allowed to private ranchers, not only in Arizona, but across the U.S. West. By the early 1930s, drought, dust storms, and the economic depression stimulated the federal government to consider the need to control and regulate grazing on all public lands. In 1933, U.S. Congressman Edward T. Taylor from Colorado introduced a bill authorizing the Department of the Interior to regulate grazing. The passage of the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934 impacted ranching by effectively closing the public domain to the U.S. West to sale, thus ending the movement of large herds across unfenced spaces, not only in Arizona, but across the U.S. West. In addition to effectively ending the open range area, the Taylor Grazing Act increased the regulatory control of the federal government over range resources. In 1934, the Division of Grazing was established in the Department of the Interior to implement the Taylor Grazing Act's provision for authorizing, folks. I would like to say that I lost my voice yelling at my children, but I have adult children and I can no longer use that as an excuse. So in 1934, the Division of Grazing was established in the Department of the Interior to implement the Taylor Grazing Act's provisions for authorizing livestock grazing on the public domain lands in 10 western states. The Division of Grazing, which later became the Bureau of Land Management, worked with area ranchers to allocate grazing privileges for the orderly use, improvement, and development of the public grazing lands. Key to this was a permitting or leasing system whereby ranchers were required to own or have control over a base property, whether land or water, to support a year-round operation. These permits or leases allowed ranchers to graze their livestock on allotments under Division of Grazing Management. The grazing authorization stipulated the area to be used, the number of cattle, the season of use, and other measures to ensure proper range practices, such as water development projects. The remainder of this presentation examines cattle ranching in that portion of the western Papagueria now defined as the BMGR East. During the historical period, these lands were largely ignored by non-Native Americans until the Gadsden Purchase of 1854. The U.S. acquisition of the area attracted settlers hoping to make a living through mining, ranching, or farming. Cattle ranching quickly became the dominant economic activity, despite the extreme aridity, difficult transportation routes, and rugged terrain. Cattle raising operations were almost always based on private land holdings, but use of the large surrounding tracts of public lands for grazing was necessary because of the acreage required to support a herd of profitable size. The Tohono O'odham, the Pima-speaking peoples of this native to this region, had a long and rich history of working with cattle by the time of the American era. Stock raising was important to the Tohono O'odham, socially, culturally, and economically. Living in a stark land with few trees and sparse underbrush, the O'odham were forced to adapt in order to turn cattle ranching into a viable economic activity. They did this by rotating their herds according to the seasons and grazing conditions. During the summer, when temperatures soared, they grazed their cattle in the foothills. Following the winter and summer rains, when both water and forage were plentiful, they shifted to the low valleys. Anglo-American ranchers who established stock raising operations in the region adapted to the arid and inhospitable conditions and adopted techniques from their Native American counterparts. Most critically is finding and developing water sources. And I think a lot more research needs to be done on how the Native Americans who knew where those water sources were communicated, that technology or that ability to the Anglo-American ranchers in the region. So it's unclear when the first Anglo-American ranchers in the Ajo-Gila Bend area started raising cattle for economic gain. Copper mines in the Ajo region began producing in 1854, with ore being shipped by mule to Yuma the following year. According to one historical account, around 1861, Tom Childs Sr. purchased 200 head of cattle and established a ranch in the vicinity of the Ajo mines. Another historical account asserted that Tom Childs Sr. began running cattle near the Gila River around 1871, and that same year filed claims in the Ajo copper deposits. By 1884, Tom Childs Sr. and his son Tom Childs Jr. had established a cattle ranch at Bottomody Well along 10 Mile Wash, so named because it was located 10 miles north of Ajo. Bottomody Well was commonly referred to as the 10 Mile and is referred to this day. From their ranch headquarters on 10 Mile Wash, the Childs family had a huge impact on the region. Their cattle operation extended across a vast area, and the family intermarried with local Anglo-Americans, Mexican-Americans, and Native Americans. And I do want to mention on this slide and other slides where you see the remains of buildings and structures and other ranching-related features. Many of these photographs were taken over the years between 2004 all the way up to the present. With a herd that at one time numbered around 2,500 head. The Childs family ran their cattle from the U.S.-Mexico border north to the Gila River and from the Tohono O'odham Reservation west to the Mohawk Mountains. The Childs name became synonymous with southwestern Arizona as the ranching empire of Tom Jr. expanded and his family grew. Through his marriage to a Hyached O'odham woman and the marriage of his children to local settlers, he became, in essence, spokesman for the region and, in fact, spoke both Spanish and O'odham as well as his native English. Childs established himself in ranching by the early 1900s and built ranches at Bottomody Well, Hotshot Well southeast of Ajo, and Green Gate Well approximately 9 miles south of Gila Bend. I do want to point out, this map is a little bit hard to read here, but where's my laser? This is the Bottomody Well, which is roughly 10 miles north of Ajo. The Hotshot Well is not on the DMGR East, and it's roughly down here, still owned by the Childs family today. And the Green Gate Well, which we're going to talk about more, is 9 miles south-southwest of the town of Gila Bend. Southwestern Arizona was extremely isolated during this period, and the Childs ranches were particularly so. All supplies had to be brought in by wagon and later by truck. The Childs family ran cattle in an immense area on both sides of the road that is now State Route 85 that runs from Gila Bend all the way down to Lukeville on the U.S.-Mexico border. Tom Childs Jr. himself lived for much of his life at the 10 Mile with his Hyached O'odham wife Marta. Childs and Marta had 13 children together and also raised numerous adopted Native American boys. The sons claimed land adjacent to theirs, expanding the size of the ranch over time. A daughter likewise claimed neighboring parcels of land. Many of the local settlers' children married into the Childs family, leading to a highly interrelated community. Childs hired local men to manage his cattle herd. These included Alonzo Puffer, a Tohono O'odham man whose father had guided noted geologist Kurt Bryan across the region in the early 1920s survey of desert watering places. Manuel Parra, a native of Mexico, also worked for Childs. Parra also ran his own small cattle operation and developed several wells and tanks west and south of Ajo. Now this slide shows the locations of 4 of the more significant ranching facilities developed by the Childs family in the early to mid 20th century. And you can see, in addition to their main ranch headquarters at Bottomody Well, there are 4 others indicated by the yellow triangle with the dot in the center. Cattle were periodically moved from one ranch to another in order to take advantage of better grazing. This shift happened frequently between the 10 Mile and Green Gate Well, the northernmost triangle up there. In the mid-1930s, Tom Child moved his extended family and cattle operation from his headquarters to Green Gate Well, located 9 miles southwest of Gila Bend. Childs leased the land from the Stouts, another ranching family in the Ajo Gila Bend area, and it's likely that Childs also developed the well and associated windmill. To support his operation at Green Gate Well, Childs improved the property by installing corrals, a water tank, watering troughs, and a gasoline-powered pump to convey water to the storage features. I do apologize, the site map on the left is very primitive, but the inset shows the water tank and a trough that is around most of the perimeter, and then you can see the purple or lavender polygons indicate artifact concentrations. The really faint orange line here is the extent of the corral, and this is a loading chute here, feeding trough, concrete pads. The blue dot in the inset is the wellhead. In fact, let's take a little bit closer look at some of these things. The photo on the left is the wellhead, And the concrete pads housed either diesel or gas-powered engines to pump the water out of the well and then transfer it to the nearby tank over here. As you can see, this is what the site looks like today. You can still recognize it as a ranching-related site, although many of the structures are in disrepair. Other buildings and ramadas and sheds like that have been collapsed. There's a tremendous amount of artifacts around there with huge can scatters and trash deposits as well. Bonnie Price, Tom Child's granddaughter, lived at the Green Gate Well during this time. According to Bonnie, in recent oral testimony, her grandfather built a 3-room adobe house with a fireplace north of the water tank and a house with walls made of railroad ties. Several small wood frame houses were brought in on flatbed trucks and set up on site. Now, Tom Childs lived by himself in a trailer that he parked on a poured concrete slab. The cowboys and other workers lived in tent houses. According to Alonzo Puffer, approximately 500 to 600 head of cattle grazed on the lands around Green Gate Well. Green Gate Well served as a temporary central ranch complex for the Childs ranching operation. After a 4-year stay, the Childs family returned to the Bottomody Well headquarters on 10 Mile Wash. Childs and his sons established Drift Fence Well in December of 1945, located in Childs Valley about 7 miles west of the Ajo-Gila Bend Highway, which is now State Route 85. The well site served as a line camp. Line camps were places where ranch hands resided while traveling the extent of a rancher's grazing range to round up cattle for branding, sorting, and shipping to market. Robert Duker Childs, son of Tom and Marta, oversaw ranching operations at Drift Fence Well. Bonnie Price and her husband Lee honeymooned at Drift Fence Well in 1947. During their extended stay, they helped Bonnie's Uncle Duker round up cattle in Childs Valley south of the Crater Range. And the next few slides show what the Drift Fence Well site looks like today. The wellhead is capped with a portion of a 55-gallon drum. And then when you look in the photo to the right, it may be hard to make out, but the well was capped in 1952, and the inscription in the concrete reads, "Closed, 6/22/52, keep out." And again, there are water storage features there. Bonnie Price mentioned that there was a huge water tank that was set up on the concrete piers. Those are the concrete piers right there. And again, remains of collapsed structures. And what's interesting, a portion of the corral that's at Drift Fence Well is constructed of used, or I should rather say unused railroad ties that are positioned vertically in the ground. The stock watering place and line camp was named after the drift fence constructed by Tom Childs in 1942 that is extended in a southeast to northwest direction from the northwest edge of Childs Mountain to the west end of the Crater Range. The drift fence bridged the gap between the Crater Range and the Growler Mountains to the south and kept Childs' cattle from wandering into the allotments of neighboring ranchers. Tom Childs Jr. passed away in 1951 at the age of 80. He left his cattle to his sons, however, they sold off most of the livestock. The Child family still owns the 10 Mile Ranch at Bottomody Well. Another prominent ranching family in the area, the Stouts, managed a cattle ranching empire on scale with the Childs operation. Their grazing lands ring the Sauceda Mountains and at one time encompassed an area from Gila Bend to Ajo to the Tohono Reservation. The first Stouts to arrive in the area were Alec and his wife Annie, who moved to Gila Bend around 1881. Alec was an engineer on the Southern Pacific Railroad, and he ran cattle as a sideline business. The Stouts homesteaded on the lower Gila River and ran their cattle from Gila Bend to the Tohono O'odham Reservation. In 1899, their son, Albert H. Stout Sr., took over the family's ranching activities, building the herd to over 1,000 head. 12,000 is a lot of cattle in an arid environment like that. He established a ranch headquarters on the Kilatosa Wash, located about 2 miles south of Gila Bend, eventually patenting a 200-acre homestead there in 1935. 4 generations of Stouts have ranched in the area around Gila Bend and what is now the DMGR East. Aside from cattle ranching, the Stout family owned and operated several businesses in Gila Bend, including a hotel, dairy, cotton farm, and the town waterworks. The Stouts, like other large ranching families, hired many local men to assist them in managing their herds. Many of the men were Tohono O'odham, including Alonzo Puffer, who worked for the family for 30 years. And I mentioned Alonzo earlier. He started out working for the Childs family, but he gravitated towards the Stouts and was gainfully employed with them for a number of years. Now this slide shows the locations of 4 of the more significant ranching facilities developed in the early to mid-20th century by the Stout family. Their homestead on the Kilatosa Wash is here, outside the DMGR boundaries, just like the 10-mile ranch was. So you see the 3 water sources that they developed. And I want to talk mostly about this one here, Tom Thumb Well in the South Santa Mountains. This is a very remote and rugged area in the western Papagueria. Tom Thumb Well is located in Cougar Canyon, a narrow north-south oriented canyon within the Saucedo Mountains. Around 1960, and again we're jumping ahead, 1960, Albert Sonny Stout III drilled the well and named it after a prominent formation to the south. As developed by the Stouts, the cattle ranching site consisted of a well, windmill, stock watering features, corrals, and a small shack to house ranch hands who maintained the well and rode the range. After developing the well, the Stouts built an elaborate gravity-fed water delivery and storage system. Centered on the well site, an approximately 60-mile long, and I did get that number right, 60-mile long network of pipes carried water to locations throughout the Saucedos where cattle could drink. At many of these watering places, the Stouts constructed corrals and loading chutes where the cattle were trapped and held for branding, sorting, weighing, and shipping. Cattle shipped from these locations were typically loaded into truck-drawn trailers and hauled to feedlots to fatten up for market. So I want to show you what this water delivery and storage system was like. About 1 mile up elevation from the Tom Thumb well site was this very large concrete-lined water tank. Water was pumped from the well all the way up to this tank and stored here. And from there, through pipe, it was gravity-fed to multiple locations throughout the Saucedo Mountains. And you can see that they used PVC pipe. There's a section of it that's exposed there. And at different points along the system, there would be these galvanized steel pipes that you encounter with little bleed valves on top. And that was to regulate or to bleed air from the water line so the water would flow downhill more evenly. And then at various places, there were standpipes that were constructed out of common elements, concrete and rubble masonry standpipes. And again, they would help not only achieve uniform pressure, but when water was in there, the roaming cattle could come by and take a drink. Now, ultimately, the water ended up in these corral areas where there were tanks and troughs to bring the cattle in. The cattle would come in periodically and they would water, and the cowboys could also trap them while they were inside these corrals. I do want to mention that there were other successful livestock operators in the area. Definitely the Childs and the Stout families ran the largest operations, and they are the most well-known when you look at the history of the area. These are the Santank Mountains over here with the Vehicle Valley. You can see that it's in proximity to the South Savis. Childs ran their stuff here. The Stouts were running cattle through there. A man named Johnson of the Gila Land and Cattle Company ran cattle in the Santank Mountains and Vehicle Valley. Around 1910, Johnson sold a portion of the ranch to the Clements, who were based at Santank Well. Their ranch was eventually acquired by the Bender family, whose headquarters were at the Johnson Ranch, named after the earlier owner, on the eastern slope of the Santank Mountains. And again, the Benders were in this area right around here. Two other families were the Pottabaums, based near Mesquite Springs in the Santank Mountains, and the Pettits, who ran cattle on the desert plains north of the Crater Range. I'd also like to note that stock raising by the Tohono O'odham was not limited to the reservation. In the early to mid-20th century, Tohono O'odham ranchers Chico Suni and Victoriano ran cattle in the region west of Ajo, which is south of the current BMGR East. And, as I stated previously, numerous Tohono O'odham cowboys worked for Anglo-American and Mexican-American ranchers on the lands that now constitute the BMGR East. These Native American ranchers transacted regularly with their non-Native American counterparts, both on and off the reservation in the buying and selling of livestock. The topography of the BMGR East is characterized by flat plains punctuated by low mountain ranges. Historically, range cattle on the western Papagueria depended on the sparse natural vegetation. Moreover, water sources were scarce. These factors presented challenges to livestock operators by limiting both the distribution of cattle and the carrying capacity, which is the number of cattle that the land could sustain. Ranching in the western Papagueria is a tenuous occupation that depends greatly on the discovery and development of water sources. With the exception of the Gila River and intermittent or ephemeral streams, surface water in the region is virtually non-existent. Ranchers had to develop water sources by digging or drilling wells, or building earthen reservoirs or tanks to collect storm runoff. Wells in the region were generally of two kinds: shallow dug wells or deeper drilled wells. Dug wells varied in depth from less than 10 feet to over 100 feet and were established by sinking a shaft through alluvium and rock. For example, Bottomote Well at Tom Child's ranch headquarters was 90 feet deep. It was a hand-dug well. Deeper dug wells were often cribbed with timber to prevent cave-ins. Deep drilled wells were generally located in the broad valleys of the region. Whether dug or drilled, wells for watering livestock needed to be easily accessible by trails and roads, and most importantly, near areas where the forage was sufficient to warrant the expense. Stock raisers also constructed earthen reservoirs, or represas, to impound floodwater. Anglo-American ranchers used the generic term of tank to refer to an engineered reservoir. Constructed on or near a normally dry stream channel, water from storm runoff is diverted into the tank. The reservoirs are full just after rains, and large ponds can hold water for several months. In some instances, ranchers constructed concrete troughs that were connected to the reservoirs by buried pipelines to water cattle away from the storage structure. In doing so, the ranchers kept the livestock from wandering over the banks of the tank to muddy and foul the water. Oh, and by the way, that particular shot, it's a beautiful shot. That tank is on the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge and not on the BMGR East. But it's typical of stock watering tanks that are ubiquitous throughout the U.S. West. Stock raisers also constructed I already did that. On the BMGR East, most of the ranchers had breeding herds or cow-calf operations, and natural vegetation served as feed. In wet years, when forage was plentiful, ranchers would put steers on the range and fatten them up for sale. Popular breeds, which were well suited for the desert environment, included Herefords, Brahmas, and Mexican steers. Crossbreeds included Brangus, which is a crossbreed of the Brahma and the Angus, and Bradford, the Brahma and the Hereford. Tohono O'odham ranchers usually raised Herefords, and that's a practice that continues to this day. On the range, cattle foraged independently. They covered large areas when grazing and were able to travel long distances for water. During the winter, spring, and fall, a herd would typically graze within a 15-mile radius of a water source and come into water every 3 or 4 days. In the summer, they would go out 5 or 6 miles and return each day to water. Following the implementation of the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, grazing on public lands was highly regulated. The carrying capacity was determined by federal and state range managers in cooperation with the leaseholders, that is, the ranchers themselves. Ranchers ran 1 or at least 2 head of cattle per section. And for those of you who know, a section is 640 acres or 1 square mile. So think about that, 1 or up to 2 head of cattle in this arid region. By doing so, they kept the overall size of their herds at a manageable level, proportionate to the extent of their grazing allotments. Keeping the numbers low protected the rooted grasses and trees, because central to any ranching operation is the movement of cattle on the range to conserve resources. When the forage in one area was nearly depleted, ranchers relocated their herds to areas with plentiful feed. The cattle were left on the range year-round to fatten. Calves were pulled and branded in the summer when the dry weather and heat kept the cattle around the water sources and were cut loose to graze. In the fall, the yearlings were weaned off and rounded up for sale. During wet years, the ranchers put steers on the range in late fall, rounded them up in May before it got too hot, and shipped them off for sale. When it came time to round up the cattle for branding or transport for sale, traditionally cowboys on horseback performed the task. Ranch hands would go to the extent of where the cattle roamed, usually a drift fence, and work their way back to the corrals where the cattle were trapped. After the calves were branded and the big calves, steers, and old cows were separated for sale, the ranch hands rode the range to round up the ones they missed, or waited until the following summer to trap them at a water source. Beginning in the 1940s, the Stouts discontinued the practice of rounding up the cattle on horseback and driving them to the corrals of the various stock watering places on their range. Instead, at the corrals, they installed a trigger gate system for capturing the cattle that operated automatically. Each corral was built around 1 or more watering troughs and usually 2 trigger gates, 1 for the cattle to trigger in and water, and 1 for the cattle to trigger out. When capturing cattle for branding or sorting for transport and sale, the ranch hands would lock the gate to trigger out. The cattle, upon entering the corral to water, were trapped. This trigger system allowed the Stouts to collect their cattle without hard riding on horseback in rugged areas of the Salceda Mountains. Now, historically, ranchers in the region employed the old-fashioned cattle drive to move their herds and to feed lots for fattening, to markets for sale, or to a railhead for shipment. Beginning in the 1930s, cattle ranchers purchased trucks with stock trailers to haul livestock from the range or ranch headquarters to market, and that effectively ended the era of the cattle drive in the region. Methods of selling cattle on the lands that now constitute the BMGR East included terminal public markets, livestock auction markets where cattle were sold to the highest bidder, and country selling. Now, the country selling method refers to the selling of cattle to feedlots, slaughterhouses, and other ranchers without brokers or agents. During the mid-20th century, the Stouts and other area ranchers often sold their livestock to a feedlot outside of Gila Bend. I'm going to explain the hard-to-read contents of this map in just a moment or two. In 1941, and this brings us back full circle to my opening remarks about the establishment of the Berry and Goldwater Range. In 1941, on the eve of the nation's involvement in World War II, the federal government set aside vast tracts of public land to establish the Gila Bend Gunnery Range, which is now the BMGR East. As the War Department proceeded to transform the southwestern Arizona desert into a gunnery range, military officials encountered resistance from the local ranchers. Not a surprise. The federal government owned most of the land set aside for the range, but had, under the Tailored Grazing Act of 1934, distributed grazing permits through 10-year lease agreements to ranchers in the area. When approached to surrender their grazing rights, the ranchers refused. President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order in September of 1941 withdrawing the land from public use. The ranchers balked at the order, and a legal battle followed. On December 26, 1941, the U.S. District Court handed down a decision authorizing the government to take immediate possession of the area. In cooperation with the war effort, the ranchers vacated the land. Because the grazing permits were leaseholds, the ranchers were subject to compensation for improvements made to their allotments and for the loss of range access to graze their livestock. The federal government executed lease and suspension agreements with the ranchers that provided compensation on an annual basis for the period the lands were withdrawn for military use. Compensation was based on the type and number of improvements on an allotment. For an example, wells, windmills, troughs, storage tanks, corrals, fences, buildings, as well as the annual average number of stock the rancher grazed on an allotment prior to the suspension of grazing rights. So in essence, the ranchers were paid not to run their cattle on the recently withdrawn military lands. And again, this is a plat map dated 1942 that was drawn up by the Real Estate Department of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Here we have the community of Ajo. Here we have Gila Bend. Here's one at State Route 85 now. You have Tom Child's ranch down here. You've got the Stouts ranch up here. And then you can see the names of some of the ranching families I mentioned. The Benders, the Pottabounds. You've got Childs here. You've got Pettit. You've got the Stouts. And their names are on here because those are the areas of their lease agreements or their allotments that fell on the lands to be withdrawn. So none of these ranchers stopped running cattle. They were forced off of the newly created gunnery range, but they ran their cattle elsewhere. Remember, the Childs family also had ranching lands down here. A lot of them ran their cattle to the north, to the east, to the northwest, and definitely to the south. Following the end of World War II, in the fall of 1945, when the gunnery range went largely unused, the Childs, the Stouts, and other area ranchers reclaimed their pastures on public lands and further impacted the landscape by drilling wells and building fence lines, corrals, and water storage and conveyance features. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 and subsequent range reactivation forced most of the ranchers off the land. Despite the lease and suspensions agreements the Air Force held with certain ranch owners, particularly those located in the eastern portion of the range, the ranchers continued to use the land for grazing purposes. And maybe I shouldn't say this, but the lease agreements were still in effect. In other words, these ranchers were being paid not to run their cattle on the range, but the Air Force let a certain ranching family, Stouts, continue to run their cattle in this area. Remember when I was talking about the Thompson well site, I said it was drilled right around 1960, and that 60-mile network of a water delivery system was installed over the ensuing years. Back to the Stouts. So in the 1950s, the Stouts were running around 400 head of cattle in the South Saga Mountains, and an indeterminate number west of State Route 85, right around Green Gate Well and near the Black Gap area. By 1966, the Stouts were grazing about 900 head of cattle on the BMGR. That same year, the Stouts were forced to move their cattle off of the BMGR east for good, and thus ended the era of cattle ranching on the BMGR east. Now, Pamela, John, you want 15 minutes for, we're right at, yeah, we have a few questions. I do have just a few more, if you'd like to see a few more slides. For the archaeologists here, the next 4 slides are examples of ranch and related property types that one would expect to encounter in an archaeological survey on the BMGR East. The first property type are watering facilities, and really these are examples of property subtypes. This property type encompasses features constructed by ranchers to harvest groundwater or collect storm runoff to supply their livestock for their own consumption. As I mentioned earlier, water is a critical commodity in this desert environment, and water management strategies are often reflected in the abandoned ranching sites across the study area. Corrals are gated enclosures for the temporary holding of livestock for processes such as branding, vaccination, sorting, weighing, and shipping. Usually corrals are configured to allow the movement of transfer of cattle from one enclosure to another. Corrals might be constructed of materials on hand, including railroad ties, milled lumber, pipe and or cut branches, and sometimes incorporate rock outcrops or boulders. What I was talking about, this is an example of a cattle chute that's found at more recent cattle ranching sites. I had mentioned in the 1940s that the Stout family stopped rounding up their cattle on horseback. And what they did is they used the trigger gates to allow the cattle to come in for water, and they could trigger in, but they couldn't trigger out. Well, each of those corrals were outfitted with one or more of these chutes. And you can see how easy it would be for a truck with a trailer, a stock trailer on the back, to back up there, and then you just run the cattle right into the trailer. Fences are another property type. They differ from corrals in that they were erected by cattle ranchers to restrict the movement of livestock by confining them to one area of the range while preserving another area from grazing. Fences also marked a boundary between grazing allotments. The most common fence associated with cattle ranching is the barbed wire fence. Ranchers constructed drift fences that extended for miles. The fences kept their cattle from drifting into neighboring ranchers' allotments. And ranching-related fences on the BMGR East are typically constructed of mesquite posts connected by barbed wire. And the last property type example I wanted to show before I end is the line camp. Line camps in the BMGR East study area were always established in association with stock watering places where there were corrals to work with the livestock. Line camps were built at widespread distances as places where ranch employees could reside while riding the fences, maintaining windmills, and other tasks necessary on the range. They typically consisted of small and simple buildings or tent houses with little or no ornamentation and were constructed using local, often salvaged materials. The photo on the left is the original line camp that was constructed at Tom Thumb Well by the Stout families. It continues to be used as a hunter's camp, like an overnight camp for people who are hunting in that area. And you may ask, well, if it's a military bombing and gunnery range, why would people be allowed to hunt in that area? Well, it's simple. This area is called Area B, and it's jointly managed by the Air Force and the Bureau of Land Management. And it's a public use area where no active live firing or training is going on. Hence, you or I, anytime you wanted, could go and request a permit, sign a hold harmless agreement, and go explore that area. So folks, thank you. I appreciate you putting up with my gravelly voice. I hope I didn't stumble over my words too much. But we do have a couple of minutes if you'd like to ask me any questions. Yes?
Was there any kind of farming or settlement, or were there any springs in this area?
The question was asked if there is evidence of Tohono farming or any springs or farming activity in the area. There is anecdotal information. One of the oral sources that I cited in my presentation, Bonnie Price, she was the granddaughter of Tom and Marta Childs, and she recalls growing up that there were a number of areas at Green Gate Well and also north of the 10 Mile Ranch, both of which are on, those sites are currently on the Goldwater Range, where the Native Americans traditionally did dry farming out there. And in terms of springs, there are very few natural springs in the area. There are a lot of tinajas and other catchments for water. Yes, sir?
Education must have been in-house. They took care of educating kids.
Education was in-house. I'm pretty sure that for those ranchers who are in close proximity to Gila Bend, they could attend the public schools there. I will say that Tom Childs established at the Hot Shot Ranch, which was the one about 6 miles southeast of Ajo, he had a functioning small community there. He was also a prospector, and so he had an assay office there. He had a slaughterhouse there. He paid a doctor to treat his family and his extended family, because remember, he not only had 13 children, he had a bunch of adopted Native American children as well. And as his children grew and married, their families lived there on the ranch. And he also paid for a teacher to be there at the Hot Shot Ranch. Now, because at that time period that the Child's children were considered mixed race, there was a period of time when some of them were sent away to an Indian boarding school. Bill, I believe that was in the Phoenix area, is that accurate?
Among other places.
Among other places, yes. Last call for questions.
How common is it for you to see structures that are constructed of upright railroad ties instead of laying down like the house and some of those corrals?
In my role as a cultural resource management consultant who has worked extensively throughout the U.S. Southwest, Goldwater Range is the only place where I've seen railroad ties employed in that manner. Robin.
Scott, what was the origin of those railroad ties?
Well, I want to say it's the New Cornelia Copper Mining Company. The Pre-Phelps Dodge company that ran the Ajo mines in the early 20th century constructed the Tucson, Cornelia, and Gila Bend Railroad. I believe that's the name of it. And basically it was a branch line railroad that ran from the mines in Ajo all the way up to the Southern Pacific Railhead in Gila Bend. And so if you're familiar with railroad technology and railroad maintenance, ties don't last forever, especially when you're running locomotives and ore-laden cars over them day in and day out. And so there were huge piles of used and unused creosote-soaked railroad ties. And so I'm sure they were salvaged from the railroad. Yes?
I'm just curious why it's called the Barry Goldwater. Is there a particular reason that it was called that?
Yes. Barry Goldwater, native Arizonan, was an officer in the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II. And at one time he was stationed at Luke Field, which is now Luke Air Force Base. And as a pilot, he was responsible for training the cadets. And I should know this because I wrote a history about the military use of the range, but I believe it was in the 1980s when it was named in honor of him. Yes, sir?
What about the land around it now? Who owns that? The old families that had land there?
Let me go back to, well, keep in mind, the families did not, the land that they owned were centered on water sources. And the lands that were withdrawn, they were leasing from the federal government to graze their cattle. So to this day, the Childs family owns the 10-mile ranch site at Bottomody Well. The Stout family owns the homestead on the Kilatosa Wash. This area right here where the Benders had their homestead, this is all part of the Sonoran Desert Conservation Area that's under the administration of the BLM. So ranching, cattle ranching persisted even after those lands were withdrawn. But these ranchers were getting grazing allotments and leases from the Division of Grazing, which is now the BLM, to run their cattle in different areas. So they retained their private property. Does that answer your question, sir?
They still are doing that?
There are members of the Childs family, yes, that are still running cattle. Yeah, and I mean, cattle ranching is still a viable economic activity, and this area would be the Tohono O'odham Reservation. If you drive this length of Interstate 8, you will see, especially to the north, you'll see active well sites and corrals there where people are still running cattle. In 2017, I interviewed a man named Pat Lauderdale, who was a longtime rancher. In fact, he's in his 80s now, and he's still cowboying. And he works on a ranch just north of Gila Bend and south of the Buckeye area. So a lot of ranching is still going on in that region. Yes?
Did any of these folks attempt to start imported forage grasses in areas where they had impoundments?
Boy, that's a really good question. One of the things when we start researching the cultural landscapes of an area like the BMGR East, we identify areas for further research, and that's definitely one of them. The BLM isn't too keen on importing non-indigenous plant species, though.
I know it was bigger in the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm. Right. I really don't have a definitive answer to your question, but I will say that's one of many areas of, of further research that needs to be followed. Well, folks, thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it.